Okay, we're going to start anyway, even though it's not working. It's working a bit, so we only have one screen today in this session instead of two. Hello, everybody. My name is James Wallis. I'm a strategy director with Anthesis, but I'm also a recovering brand consultant, which is why I'm going to talk about brands today. I started my career in market research and then moved into kind of brand and marketing strategy consulting. And it took me about 10 years to notice that my job was selling things that made people fat. I had one of those things. Probably lots of you guys have gone through this as well, and if you're sort of smart enough to make the decision right first time round. Had a bit of a dark night of the soul and moved into sustainability. But I'm still very interested in brands and still believe in their potential, especially in crisis, in driving the change that we need to see and shaping the world that we want. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. As I say, we will be based off this screen and not that one, which is tantalizingly dark here. You keep looking at it, but no, nothing's going to happen there. So we're going to start just with a couple of things. And there's going to be a little bit of audience interaction. So I put something that probably all of you have seen before many times on screen. And I just like people to say the words that come into their head. What? Children. Play. Fun. The biggest volume in tiles in the entire world. That's a good fact associated with the brand. What about, brilliant, thank you. What about this one? Expensive. There's so many words at once there. This is obviously a very strong brand. Exclusive, expensive, quality, sport, white collar, crime, did you say? White collar crime, quite possibly. Yeah, there may be negative connotations with some of these brands. How about this one? Sports. That one also, actually, we had sports in Rolex. I tried to choose three brands that were totally different from each other, but actually there is an overlap with Rolex and Nike here. So sports, just do it. Health, shoes, sweatshops. Yep, still struggling with that one. Athletes. Okay, good. So those were just some logos and just some pictures that immediately sort of carry all sorts of meaning to us. And they carry that meaning because we've seen these things over and over and over again. And because the companies behind them have created these associations in our minds so that when we see this weird little picture, it means something to us. It speaks to us. We know kind of what to think about it. It may be a bad thing or a good thing, but it has a really consistent view, and probably most people in the room have pretty consistent views of what these things are for. If we asked everybody individually, you get a lot of overlap. So those are brands, and what I want to talk about is a little bit the sort of who cares of brands, because this is obviously a sustainability-focused event. Most people probably in this room will have a sense that there's a connection between brands and businesses and sustainability. But just to sort of dig in a little bit on this question and why brands might be important in this picture and in crisis. So we heard a little bit this morning about the idea that the change we need, it's not climate change, it's mind change. The change we need is between our ears. And when we think about the power of those three pictures that we just looked at, they change the things, the ideas, the thoughts, the beliefs that are between our ears. So I've got another question for people, which is, how many ads does the average US person see in the average day? I chose US because that's the only place there's data. So I'm sort of following where the data is there. But any ideas on that? 100? 200? 1,500? We're going up. Who give me 2,000? So it turns out it is really hard to get data on this, and nobody really knows. But the best studies put it between 4,000 and 10,000 per day. So that's the number of marketing messages that an ordinary American will see on an ordinary day. And I think images like the one we just had on screen start to show you why. There's probably about 1,000 just in that picture. So it would be weird if those messages didn't change the way we thought, the way we felt, the way we behaved on all sorts of different topics. In fact, that's why they put them out there. There's this famous thing about advertising, which is a CMO once said that I know that half the money I spend on advertising is wasted, but I don't know which half. So a lot of that is just pollution that makes no impression whatsoever, but a lot of it is stuff that actually does speak to us. If we're the target audience or it hits us at the right moment, it changes what we think about businesses and ultimately what we buy. So they're very influential. They're influential in changing the things that are going on between our ears. Another reason to care about brands is their value. Maybe you're an investor and you're interested in the value of the brands we're talking about, because when you buy companies, normally there is a value allocated to the sort of goodwill, the reputational asset represented by the brand, independent of the factories and all of the other capital that organization might have. So who would like to guess the value of the 100 most valuable brands in the world? In US dollars, because that's what I've got it in. Any ideas? Just throw a number out there. I mean, nobody's going to get it. So have an idea. Trillions. Okay, yeah, good. We're on the right track there. Any more? Trillions? We'll start with trillions. Very specific. So according to the Kantar Brand Z study, which is one of the two kind of most famous brand valuation studies, along with the Interbrand one, which you probably have seen, the 100 most valuable brands in the world are worth $8.7 trillion, which is such a big number that when I saw it, I thought, shit, that's a big number. I was surprised. And I had to write it down 3 times in 3 different ways to understand what that number was. So there's an 8 and a 7 and loads of zeros. There's an 8.7 trillion in capital letters because trillions are a lot. Or another way of thinking about that is $8,700 billion. And that I've also learned, I think, is about 10 times the GDP of the Netherlands. So you've got 10 times the GDP of the Netherlands ostensibly sitting on the balance sheets of 100 companies in the form of brands. So they're valuable as well. You don't want to screw them up if you're a company, if you're an investor. So they can change the way people think, you can change the way people feel, you can change what they do. And they're also really important assets to protect if you're a company, if you're an investor. So one little follow-up question, fun follow-up question. Maybe I'll pick on you at the front. What? We were discussing this earlier. This gentleman works for Microsoft. So estimated value of the Apple brand alone? 2.2 billion. So alone, it's worth nearly $1 trillion. Now, actually, it's important to say that the brand valuation methodologies are pretty controversial. So there are some that are used to track things over time. So, this might not be realistic. The Interbrand, the other credible one, puts the value of the Apple brand at a mere $450 billion. So, nothing really by comparison. The point is basically that they're a lot. And just a little chart to say, from the very same study, these things are associated, strong brands are associated with superior shareholder returns in this case. So they took the 10 most powerful brands in according to their methodology, I think the 100, the S&P 500 and the World Index there. And it just shows you the differentiated performance of those organizations over time. Now, that's not necessarily all attributable to their brands, but it shows that those strong brands are associated with outperformance in shareholder terms, which is what a lot of companies and investors and others are interested in. So the weirdest thing about all of this influence, value, is this, that they don't really exist. So we think about these things as intangible assets, and they're intangible because they're kind of ideas or constructs, and yes, you can put pictures of them on stuff, but that's not the brand. The brand is an ephemeral, ethereal thing that is just out there in culture, in society, that is shared. It's intersubjective. It's a social reality, but it doesn't have any physical extension. It's not a factory. It's not a bit of kit that you can pay for and that does stuff. So they don't exist, which raises the question, and you can tell as I was putting this together in a stream of consciousness way, what actually is a brand? Which I'm going to offer you guys as a serious question. What even is a brand actually? Any ideas on that? Anybody willing to venture a definition or just say something about what brands do? Because we have just been talking about it, so you should have some ideas by now. Say again? Image, yes. A feeling, perception, yep. Identity, image, feeling, perception, story, value. Great. Associations. Good. Well, I think we're in the same space there. These kind of these valuable meanings that are created, and I think it's also helpful when we want to dig into this question to go back to the beginning of brands. And I'm not going to take you all the way from the beginning to now, blow by blow, but probably all of you know that the word brand, which still means this, was the little burnt mark that you put on the bum of a cow to show that it's your cow. And you burn that little symbol in. Maybe I'd have a little JW saying it was my cow, so that everybody knew whose cow it was. So that's what brand means, and it still has that meaning, still used in that way. And over time, it was really just became a kind of simple necessity. If you make a product, you've got to put a piece of writing on that product to describe what that product is. Just, what are you going to find inside this bottle? That worked for quite a while. Who made it? Where did it come from? What is it? But it became quite obvious that companies, people who are making things and selling them, could actually sell more stuff for higher prices by building more associations. These little labels on the bottles could do more than just describe what's in the product so that people know where to find it, although they still do that. They can come to stand for things like exotic provenance, or particularly crafty make, or exceptional quality among all of the other competitors. That means that maybe you'd be prepared to prefer that bottle of stuff over the other bottle of stuff. And this is what grew a lot of companies over the late 19th and early 20th century. The first advertising agencies were founded long before the first management consultancies. Before there was McKinsey, there was a McCann Erickson, founded in 1908. And McCann Erickson grew with a very famous brand called Coca-Cola that is a tin, at that time a bottle, of, and it had questionable ingredients at that time, but a little bottle of sugar water that was brown. But as the Coca-Cola name got built and as McCann Erickson worked with the Coca-Cola company, they built associations through the colors, through the typography, through the advertising, the communications that meant freedom, that meant fun, that meant happiness, and all of the things that make Coca-Cola the kind of reflex brand that it is today. So they're a big engine on all of this, and here are kind of a few definitions of what, or ways that you can think about brands. The idea that a brand is the identity, somebody mentioned that, of a product, a service, a company, or organization. That it should be a consciously crafted relationship. Somebody, I think, touched on that, between a company and its audiences. It's an intangible reputational asset that has a dollar value attached to it, or represents value to that organization that holds it. Or a nice one, which is a promise of something, which I think somebody also mentioned. And the trick behind that question is that there is no right answer to it. There are more or less useful ways of thinking about brands, and just like burning cow bums and putting labels on letters, the meaning of brands evolves. They evolve to fit the environment, the reality in which they find themselves. And I actually read, this was also in the Brand Z report, so if you don't like anthesis for your brand strategy, try Kantar. So brands are the company's connection to the outside world, to our planet, and to its people. Starts to sort of give you a sense of how we might think about brands today, how brands might morph and evolve and become something that they have not been in the past, and take on new responsibilities, new accountability to the world in a way that they haven't had to before. This idea that it's the connection between a company and the outside world, to its planet and its people. There's all sorts of holes you can pick in that definition, of course, but it's quite a useful way to think about it. And brand strategies, the kind of work that I used to do, is the process really of designing that connection, understanding what that connection should look like, And from there saying, okay, what are we going to make? Let's put it back into the company and say, we want to stand for this thing. We want to stand for freedom sugar water. That means we've got to make freedom sugar water. And we've got to do that in a particular way. So back into the supply chain, back into R&D, back into everything we do as a company to fit the image we want to create in the world. And then also, it tells us what's going on in the outside world. It changes production, but it also changes consumption because it changes the messages that we put out and the way we influence the hearts and minds of consumers. So when it's done best, that's how brand strategy is done. And when it performs best, that's how it's done. Sometimes it's not done that well, and it's just used as a wrapper. It's a logo and some colors and a kind of visual style that has nothing to do with what's really going on in the product or in the company. But that's not good brand strategy. Everybody with me so far? Yeah? Okay. So we're all in crisis. Brands are in crisis for the same reason everybody is in crisis, in a kind of slow motion, sort of distant way that is no less real because of it. And we've been hearing a lot about that this morning, and everybody here knows a lot about that. So brands exist in a world in crisis, but brands themselves are also in crisis as assets, especially smaller ones. The top 100 brands has actually increased in value because people trust them more. They flock to the brands they know and they trust in COVID. But a lot of brands have lost value. And why are brands in crisis? So I'm going to show you a film now, which may not be audible because we didn't get time to test the audio. And if it isn't audible, then it will make no sense whatsoever. But it's a film that some of you will have seen before. It went out in the UK in 2017. So here we go. Oh, hang on. Tantalizingly close. Okay, so I hope some of that was audible. I think that short section, I hope you don't mind me spending a couple of minutes on it, sort of did in a really small way change the world. That went in the UK, as I say, I think in 2017. And it suddenly woke people up to the real life, emotional, heart, gut impact of plastic pollution in the oceans, and what that looks like, what that feels like, what that experience is like for these whales that are really not totally distant from us, and knowing that that is replicated all over the place, all the time, at vast scale. And that changed the level of concern. It was a step change. Companies that were like, over 15 years, we're going to change our plastic to this. Suddenly, we're in an operating environment where public opinion had shifted, not like this, but like this. And the face of those companies is brands. So this is a Greenpeace. I think they do this quite a bit. It's good. It's a good initiative, good exercise to go around plastic polluted beaches and just bag up the branded trash. We've got Coca-Cola, who we talked about. We've got some Greek brands. This is obviously from a Greek beach. Unilever, Nestle. Branded trash washing up on the beaches. And there's lots of numbers, and I'll hit you with some numbers in a minute about the numbers of people who think we need to be doing more and brands ought to be engaging more and being more environmentally responsible. But actually, it's really the feelings, as I think we heard a bit this morning from Thomas, that really will change minds and mindsets. And it's a crisis for brands because they are the cliff face of consumerism. People understand that there is a relationship between Coca-Cola and plastic. And there is a much higher standard, much more holding to account going on there. So in a nutshell, brands are in an operating environment that contains much more expectations, much higher expectations. Those expectations are backed with much more scrutiny. If you're at an ESG panel, for example, this morning, we heard a bit about CSRD as well. There is much more disclosure being forced, being mandated for large companies, and that will only expand. So those expectations can be tested. It's very hard to hide now. It's very hard to escape the reputational knock-on effect of bad practices, which are all connected to the brands that consumers see. And of course, there's competition. So if you're not doing it, some other bugger over there is doing it, and that looks like an advantage in the marketplace. They will outcompete you. So brands are operating in that world. They're responsible for that stuff. They're responsible for the dead pilot whale calf in a distant and indirect way. It's the system and so on. But also, they are responsible for it, and they're held accountable for it. And they're in a world of expectation, scrutiny, and competition. So the Edelman Trust Barometer is a bit of a classic source, annual big global trust survey that looks at trust in businesses, brands, institutions, in medicine, in government, and so on. I'm more attracted to brands that focus on making the world a better place versus brands that focus on making me a better person. Even that's actually quite demanding. Nike might be the kind of brand that's a bit like that. But in this 2021 Trust Barometer, that was the balance of people's reported preference. Another interesting thing, this is a slightly complicated chart, but they also asked about a set of brands. Do you see this brand as functional only? So it just says, does what it says on the tin, as we like to say. Do you see a brand as kind of reflecting the world we live in today? Or do you see this brand as actually activist in trying to change the world we live in today at the level of culture, at the level of environment, society? And what they found is that the ones that were more over here were more trusted. And of course, trust is a huge asset for brands. The more that brands are willing not just to reflect culture as it is, which is the way a lot of marketers think and work, but to actually engage in changing it, the more trusted those brands will become. So there's lots of these sorts of numbers, and I've got another one for you in a moment, but that indicate the direction of travel for brands. If that's the reality, if the pilot whale is the crisis, this is what people want from them, and they're not doing it, and that leads to some quite worrying things, at least for the Davos Edelman type function here, which is 52% of their massive global survey with millions of respondents. I mean, literally millions over the years. People agree capitalism as it exists today does more harm than good in the world. A majority, just. So that's quite a serious situation. And this is marketing, this is branding, this is where the discipline of marketing and the discipline of branding is today. Hopefully everybody's seen this thing before and it's not just a complete surprise. We're sitting in a burning room. It's all blatantly and obviously on fire around us, both at the level of business performance and at the level of the wider world, the planet and society. And we're still thinking in the very old way, the legacy model that says this is fine. And so what we need to do is change. And because the definition, the understanding, the meaning and the role of brands can evolve over time and always has, from cattle Saltburns to Coca-Cola, it can change again, and it is changing again among the kind of the best companies. So I won't torture you with all of this because I've just said all this stuff, so I'm not quite sure why I wrote it down in the presentation. It's the last bits that are important. Crisis can and must catalyze a transformation and expansion in the role of brands. It can do it, crisis can do it, because we can see a lot of the things that are going on in the crisis. We can see what's wrong. We can see that it is not right to be putting that much plastic in the oceans. It is not right to be emitting that much carbon, and that it keeps going up. And on the other side of that, the negative space around that crisis is the kind of world we want. We want the world where we're not doing that, where we're not destroying biodiversity, where people do have clean water to drink and reliable access to enough food to eat. And it must, because it has to, otherwise we're screwed. So that's an exciting role that brands can play, and that's about using their power, their influence, and their value to build the world we want and need. So I'm nearly there. This is the heroic concept of brands. So I've just tried to draw a little bit of contrast between two different models, and I've described the one on the left as the legacy concept, and then the one on the right, in rather a grandiose way, as the heroic concept of the brand. So I'm trying to think of a reason now why I said heroic in the title for this thing. How can I justify that? I think there's just the role of the hero. The hero goes out, solves problems, makes things right again, often in the face of adversity and challenge. And that is a role that brands can assume. You know, very often when we're thinking about sustainability strategy, and I do a lot of this kind of work, we are talking about corporate entities doing incremental change in a particular way. Brands already have missions. They already have essences and goals and ambitions in their brand strategy. They have positionings, things that they want to go out and do in the world. So they can be heroic if we choose those missions right. So I've made a list of words for the legacy concept and the heroic concept that draw out some of the contrasts in the way things have been done and the way things, I would say, ought to be done. And this is definitely a normative thing. It's not necessarily saying all of the brands that do this were going to perform, but ostrich ship. So ostrich ship is burying your head in the sand, not taking ownership, responsibility, accountability, not only for your own value chain, which still remains a bit of a frontier for a lot of brands, but for the problems that people and planet are facing. Ostrich ship is basically hiding until they come and bite the ostrich on the arse and say, you know, you can't ignore me anymore, and then you increase the amount of recycled PET in your bottles and so on. Not to say there's anything wrong with that, but it is not taking ownership of the issues and your impacts in the world. And the hero takes ownership. The legacy concept focuses very much on customer and consumer, because that's what brands are for. They're there to generate and sustain demand at a profit. So there's some level of rightness in that, and it's not to say that that should go away, but it should be expanded to encompass people and planet. It's not just what does the customer, the consumer need, it's also what does the people and the planet need. And what can I choose to target among that? What will I make my mission? It's not just about generating demand, it's actually about creating empowerment. There's a very interesting, when you look at purposeful brands, the ones that actually do that well, a lot of them they do generate demand, but they generate demand by solving problems for people, making it possible for them to do things that they couldn't do before, including live in line with their values. Probably everybody has heard about, you know, these consumer surveys that say, 89% of people are definitely going to spend their money on more sustainable products, and then when they get to the supermarket shelf, actually only 35% of people do. And there's a big gap there. And there's a bit of cynicism that says, okay, that gap is just people lying in a survey because they know what kind of image they want to project or who they want to be. But there's other evidence that says that that's not just that's not a lie. It's actually because it's really hard to make those choices. They're more expensive. The products don't perform as well. They're harder to find. It's very hard to know actually what is the more sustainable choice and what isn't. Too much corporate greenwashing means that I can't trust the products I'm buying. So if we can empower people even to close that gap, then we're helping them to solve problems in their lives. Purpose wash to purpose driven. Purpose wash, there's a lot of purpose wash out there. Brand purpose is a sort of slightly corrupted agenda. You see a lot of bad examples. The classic is the Kendall Jenner PepsiCo puts gives the riot policeman a tin of Pepsi and solves the protest. The very good looking Clean Streets protest is solved by a tin of Pepsi and everybody's friends again, while there's a guy playing a cello on the roof. That was the other part of that ad. There are mistakes that get made in purpose a lot, and there's a lot of brands that say, oh yeah, we have a purpose, but it's not their real purpose. Their purpose, they use that purpose to make a film that makes people cry, or makes them feel good, or that greenwashes or purpose washes them. But they don't take it as the fundamental intention of their brand. They don't take it as their actual mission and use purpose as a byproduct, which is what the very best, and this is hard, but the very best of these companies do. Competitive to coliberative. That's not a real word. We had some excellent puns this morning as well. So the competitive view is the fundamental view of business, that it is very much about market share, outcompeting, outperforming your peers, the others who want to sort of take your money and take your market share. And it is an adversarial mindset. It's a sort of enemy worldview. And coliberative, and that extends up and down the value chain, by the way, as well. So it's not just within your market. It's not just trying to steal share from other avocado sellers, but also usually to try and screw the farmer for as much of their product for as little price as you can. It's competitive and adversarial in that way as well. Whereas actually brands can be engines of co-liberation. If you're empowering and you are giving to your stakeholders more opportunities, then you're operating in a way which is co-liberative, and you see your peers and your competitors, in a classical sense, as people who are spurring you to get better and to improve. Business message, business model. You can't hide anywhere with the new scrutiny that's here. Brands used to be about messages, now they're about models, because you can't hide your business model. A great business model will be self-advertising. People can see it, and the more high quality, high impact work that you do in it, the more likely it is to work and to perform for you. And your brand can help to define what this should look like. Caution and courage, pretty obvious. Creative and creative, because they all need to be creative, and that's one of the final sort of magical powers of brands, which is that they're creative in a way that a lot of corporate work is not creative, or actively shouldn't be, like accounting. In places. Sometimes accounting definitely should be creative, but not in the financial sense. So those are the two ideas of the legacy concept, the heroic concept. I've got some brands that probably everybody knows that represent, I think, the heroic concept. Who Gives a Crap, that has an explicitly sanitation-driven mission and much more sustainable toilet paper on a subscription model. Pretty clever. Give 50% of their profits to build sanitation and reliable sanitation in places that don't have it. Nespresso may be more controversial and definitely on a journey, as we've seen, using their sustainable sourcing strategy to restart a nascent or legacy coffee industry in conflict-riven parts of the world, South Sudan, formerly guerrilla-controlled Colombia, using their business model as a force for good. Tony's probably doesn't need any introduction, about slavery and value chains and really confronting that issue, and also great product. Also, this one does not need any introduction probably to this audience, and I think is the ultimate expression of this kind of heroic approach to branding, which is giving the thing away, and not just giving it away at random, giving it to Earth as stewarded, as represented by a board of responsible people for this multi-billion-dollar brand and phenomenon. I've got more I can talk about here, but this is it. Brands are the intersection between production and consumption. They can change the world, and heroic brands can do it. And as I say, it doesn't guarantee success. Taking that approach isn't easy. It's hard, and it's not necessarily going to work, but it is actually the kind of change that we need in the way that brands should think about what they do. So that is enough talking from me. People have stayed awake mostly. Well done, thank you, that was a lot. So any questions, or indeed sort of thoughts or ideas that this has raised up? Yes. Do we need, here we go.
Yeah, thank you. This is from a corporation perspective, but you also see that environmentalism or the climate agenda also basically needs better branding or a better story to be told. So I was wondering if you have thoughts on that you could share.
Yes. No, I mean, 100%. I haven't got organised thoughts to share on it, but actually staying in the Hampton Hilton in that shopping centre down around the corner last night, there was a great big screen outside that had ads for the climate NGO, is it called Just Dig It? I think it's a Dutch one, Just Dig It, doing really good quality climate communication, big, bold, simple, easy to understand, positive, optimistic messaging that makes people feel empowered. So that, that is a brand that isn't attached to a product or service in a commercial sense, but is changing hearts and minds. It is. Yep. No, I agree. I agree. And I don't have the answer except maybe to point fingers at people who are doing it wrong and saying it was all too, it all feels too big, it all feels too threatening, it all feels too distant. And if you can make it seem small, tractable, exciting, create that promise of a better, cleaner air by itself is a pretty good reason for, from the mobility point of view in cities, and make it and bring some optimistic tonality, which is, responding in a positive way to that crisis, then you're much more likely to engage people, and bring those kind of tangible actions. I thought some of the examples from Aosta, who we were hearing from, were wonderful at that level because they made it feel very close and very tangible. These distant abstract things like livelihoods in value chains and bits of soil, they're there. They're actually in the packet in some cases. So yeah, others might have also much better ideas on that. So you're first.
But I'll make it really quick. But I think on the other hand that there are brands hanging on for their dear life, like oil companies spending billions of dollars on messaging that it's your fault, that the carbon emissions are your fault, and Coca-Cola has advertisements, help us recycle. They spend so much money to make it not a thing. Yeah.
Absolutely, and I think there's been a many more people have noticed that in the last couple of years, the sort of transfer of responsibility onto the citizen, the consumer, the oil companies or the soft drink companies saying, nothing we can do about it. It's not like we're sitting on top of these wells pulling all the fossil fuels out of there. It's just you guys heating your homes, you bastards. Put on a jumper. That's obviously not appropriate. And I think it's important to say in this whole context, brands are one bit of the picture, they're not the whole picture. But that is not... It may be, in some cases, maybe authentically, genuinely well-intentioned engagement from those companies, even if completely misconceived, in fact, in terms of the transfer. It might not be, but it doesn't reflect a holistic and long-term view of the systemic changes that are necessary. And if you're thinking about a heroic concept of a brand and what it chooses as its mission, it has to understand that mission in the bigger context and in the long-term context. And if you can do that in a way which is responsible and assume that you have good motivations, then you're much more likely to get to the brand experiences that are actually going to help and not just be a kind of transfer of responsibility. Yes? Oh, yes.
James, thank you for presentation. I wonder, how do you pitch sustainability to your friends and relatives, if you do?
The thing I've got furthest with on that is agriculture. Did you know that a third of the planet's soil is degraded and blowing away as dust? That it turns out, possibly fake stat, that there are 60 harvests left as of 2015, as a way of just sort of opening the door to the negative side of the conversation. Say, look, actually there is all of these things. You think farmers and you think agriculture. There's some good numbers showing that farmers are some of the most trusted people in many societies. And of course, farmers themselves are, there's no reason to distrust them, but the agricultural system that they are a prisoner of is radically at odds with what the planet needs, and people don't know that. So they find it surprising enough to listen and pay attention. And if you can surprise people, then you can get into tangible things they understand about food production, the threat to that, how many people we're going to need to feed in 2050, how we're wasting a third of the food that we produce. Those numbers sort of hit people. Surprise is the door opener. And then to say, and yet, there's all of this great stuff happening that can make it better, and that those are things that we should want. People want clean waterways. They want life in the oceans. They want education for people all around the world. It seems hard to say, no, they don't really need that, or that they shouldn't have enough to eat. So there's a lot of ground level stuff that is much closer to people than the abstraction of sustainability or regeneration, or however we choose to frame it. So I think that's the place where I do not necessarily have a high success rate, but that's normally what I try and do. Yeah. Do we have some? Yes. Go next.
Do you also help companies from the legacy concept to the heroic concept, and how do you do that? Because you said yes.
Yes. Or they ask us to, and we don't always succeed. So I think that vision of brands that I expressed there is the kind of long-range thing that we would pitch to the most ambitious clients, with obviously a bit more unpacking and tangible examples and so on. Some of them say they want it, and we try and help them do it, but it does come up against some of the other sort of institutional barriers and trade-offs that and short-termism that naturally exists in companies. And what we found, I think, especially in the last couple of years, is that as we're taking on a change like that at the level of a brand, we need to hugely expand the sort of frame of reference for the piece of work, which is say we're not just going to think about your consumer and your marketing and the kind of immediate stakeholders and long-term future and stuff that your consumers might care about, but to say also internally what is going on with your organizational strategies, what is going on with your governance structures, your culture, your operating models in your supply chain, in your value chain. What are the things that will represent barriers to this change actually being enacted? And how, is it right to approach those now, or is it right to take the first steps and to then loop back around when you've proven success with hopefully not just an advert that makes people cry, but actually doing something that generates performance and creates a win that you can celebrate and then spread around the company. So I wish I could do that reliably, and I haven't been able to yet. But I think the kind of direction is there. And it really comes back to the same thing, which is it's a holistic challenge. It's a holistic challenge in the context of a company, but it's also a holistic challenge in the context of a wider system. And we just have to do the bits that we can rather than do nothing.
So, do you think Patagonia is the perfect example of a heroic concept, or is it my too much?
I think it has a lot of the characteristics and has set the pattern for a lot of those things for brands. So I think it's in the way that they manage their brand and their business. I'd say they're probably the closest company I can think of any scale. I think there's lots of much smaller companies, but of a genuinely sort of large apparel company, I can't think of anybody, or even in any category, anybody who's doing it as fully as they are. Are they perfect? Definitely not, and I don't think they would say they are either. One feature of their heroism has been in, I think, showing a path to others. So doing all sorts of counterintuitive, weird things that get attention, that help people to understand what this agenda could and should be about, and the potential that exists within it with that disruptive thinking. And the latest thing from Yvon Chouinard, which is an act of considerable wealth sacrifice, I think is a great sort of concrete example of that. So I think they've been trailblazers, but yeah. 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 Great. I agree. And I think one of the things that's interesting is the way that they've gone into some other spaces like regenerative agriculture, which feels a long way from where they are, but is such a material thing for the planet.
What is your take on transparency as a from a company perspective in terms of your heroic concept?
I think to the extent that it is sort of mandated by different reporting frameworks and compliance, I think is extremely important in creating visibility and accountability. And insofar as those frameworks are well designed and those disclosures are honest, then it helps to create signals, signposts to the kind of work that needs to be done. Unilever has, I think, practiced that quite extensively over the Sustainable Living Plan, and they published a report in, I think, 2020 or 2021 that was how well have we done on the Sustainable Living Plan. There are a whole bunch of the big commitments that they made in 2011 that they've essentially made no progress on, and they're quite open about that, basically saying that this was way harder than we thought when we set that commitment. We had no idea how we could do it. We made this little bit of progress, but nothing like what we wanted to. And there's a fundamental humility and openness in there, which I think, from a branding and a reputation point of view, reads very positively to the world, because it implies that you are being open about your failings, and therefore that you're not hiding something else. And that might not always be true, but as a piece of body language and tonality from brands, I think it can really serve them well. And many companies are quite nervous about that because there are other liabilities. There are things that, there are some risks inherent in it. But I work a lot with Nestle, and I think the corporate comms people at Nestle would say that they're probably, despite their best efforts, quite often at the other end of that spectrum of just being quite closed. Historically, I think they've got a lot better in recent years, but quite closed, not wanting to talk that much externally or engage that much externally, or certainly not to share that much in the way of flaws. So I think it really helps in this setting to be as sort of transparent and open as you can, and to bring humility with that, and not to regard that as a huge risk, but actually a piece of authenticity. Yes. The next session is gone. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Right, sorry. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Really enjoyed that.